I can give a brief overview as to how CFTC jurisdiction would apply to the space. And, so I'm with Lab CFTC, which is our FinTech engagement initiative. And the topic of cryptocurrencies has obviously become a pretty large one for us over the past year or so. At the end of 2017, we had the launch of Bitcoin futures products. So to the extent that a cryptocurrency like Bitcoin is a commodity and you launch some type of a future swap or derivatives product based on that commodity, it's an area that the CFTC has oversight jurisdiction. And what that means is that we oversee the exchanges that would facilitate trade in those types of instruments and those instruments themselves. What's important to note is that we also have enforcement jurisdiction over potential fraud and manipulation in the interstate commerce of a commodity, so in the underlying trade of a commodity. But we do not have oversight authority over trading in the spot platforms or in the cash platforms, cash market. So there's regulatory oversight of the exchanges and the futures product. There's broad enforcement jurisdiction over fraud and manipulation, but not oversight over the underlying spot or cash markets. So I can at least start there and not directly answer your question.
Okay. So it seems to me one of the challenges is that these markets are global, but your jurisdiction is only in the US. So how can you reach out to other jurisdictions?
Yeah, so not dissimilar from a lot of other markets or products that we regulate. So look, financial markets today are global. Things trade globally. So that requires a fair amount of coordination, cooperation with foreign jurisdictions. Certainly in the broad fintech space, one of the characteristics that I think is noteworthy about whether it's cryptocurrencies or in other areas is it's driven by the internet, right? And the internet doesn't recognize traditional geographic boundaries, whether that be at the state level here in the US, federal level, or when you start looking internationally. So I think it does put even more of an imperative into having those types of close relationships with international jurisdictions. From a Lab CFTC perspective, because we engage with fintech broadly speaking, we've spent a lot of time over the past year and a half trying to collaborate with some of the other leading global regulators. Earlier this year, we entered into a fintech cooperation arrangement with the UK's Financial Conduct Authority. And just over the last month or so, we did the same with the Monetary Authority of Singapore, as well as just a few weeks ago, we announced the same type of a relationship with the Australians through ASIC. So, through those types of relationships and partnerships, we can share high-level information as to what we're seeing and learning, talk about different types of regulatory approaches, what works well, what doesn't work as well, and help foster certain types of innovation by helping innovators with essentially warm handoffs. If someone's interested in moving from the US over to the UK or Australia or Singapore, we can actually help put them in touch with a human being who you can speak to from those jurisdictions.
And so one last question about this. How much is the coordination with the SEC? Because sometimes a token can be a security and a commodity and a currency at the same time. And so, the companies have to interface with many different agencies.
Yeah, so there's substantial coordination with the SEC. And just to, again, level set there in terms of, where jurisdictions begin and end. Under the CFTC framework, the Commodity Exchange Act is our enabling statute. And the definition of commodity under the Commodity Exchange Act is very, very broad. There are a lot of things that are commodities. Again, just because something's a commodity doesn't mean that the regulator, that's the CFTC, immediately takes an interest. I mean, a soccer ball is a commodity, and we're not out there policing for fraud and manipulation in the sale of soccer balls. But to the extent that something is a security, that's essentially a carve-out from the CFTC's jurisdiction. So you all have learned and heard so much about the Howey test over the last 18 months. But of course, we have to collaborate closely with the SEC because to the extent that something is a security, that would be subject to SEC jurisdiction. If you have a commodity and again, the potential for futures, swaps, derivatives products based on that commodity, then it enters CFTC world. So a lot of collaboration between the two of us just on a bilateral basis. And then more broadly, there's the FSOC, the Financial Stability Oversight Council, that's created a digital asset working group. So that consists of the major bank regulators, capital markets regulators like the SEC and CFTC. And so we also have a platform across federal government to be able to coordinate on these types of issues.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. So Mira, let's start talking about if I am an entrepreneur and I want to create a token. What are the legal ways you can actually issue tokens? So there are a lot of jargon going on. There is SAFT, there is Reg D, Reg A+, Reg S, Reg crowdfund. Can you bring some clarity to what are the pros and cons of all the different ways you can, it's not an IPO, but you basically go ICO.
Yeah, so that goes back to what Daniel said before. The question is it a security or not? And because if it's not, then it's easier. And there are attempts to, so let's start from the beginning. So if it is a security, then the securities regulations govern it, and you have to file a registration statement, which means an IPO, and that's very expensive, and it's economically prohibitive if you are a startup. So we try not to do that, although there is I think there is one ICO that actually is doing it right now with the real estate connected issues, but that's really not for most tokens. So the question, so you would like it not to be a security, or if you don't want a registration, you can also find an exemption, provided that you actually qualified for that exemption, and then even though it is a security, you can still go ahead and issue it, because an issue or offer an issue of securities are being governed by the securities regulations and subject to penalties if you don't follow them closely. So, so we can talk about, if you want to later, what is a security, but assuming it is a security already, so we are looking for an exemption. And the exemptions varied, in what kind of, how you can use them and what is the cost of using them. And one of the things that we are really looking for as a startup is also state securities regulations. Because it's not just the SEC and it's not just the federal government, it's also each state. So if you issue securities to holders all over the country, I have to comply with every state where my shareholder is going to reside in. And that is really too much from an enforcement perspective, from the fact that it's just too expensive. So I'm trying to come up with an exemption that also gives preemption, which means that I don't need to qualify for also with the state regulations, I just have to cover federal regulations. So basically that, because otherwise we have more exemptions, but that narrows down the exemptions to basically Reg D and the new Reg A+. Now even within that, sort of what I'm looking for, so the most common way that people are doing it is actually Reg D. And within Reg D, the way that startups are doing that is Rule 506C, mainly because we get this exemption from complying with state securities regulations, what you might have heard as blue sky laws. And so then the question, why do you prefer Reg D to Reg A+? Now Reg A+ is much more expensive and involves filings that Reg D, you can get exempt from that. Having said that, if you follow Reg D, then what you're selling is a restricted security, which means you have a restriction on reselling of that security, our token, which you don't get with Reg A+.
Oh, so what are these restrictions?
So you cannot resale. Sort of if you already got this token security and you want to sell it to the public or to someone else, then you have restrictions. So basically what that means is you'll have to wait a year under one of the exemptions, or file a registration, or sell it to accredited investors. So it's all problematic unless we use Reg A+, which is expensive. And if we are using Reg D 506C, it's also, you want to sell it to accredited, so you have to sell it to accredited investors, and you have to, the company, the issuer has to make sure that those people are really accredited investors, which means if you are an individual, you have to have a minimum of an income. Right now it's at least $200,000 over the last 2 years, 300,000 if you include your spouse, or a net income of at least $1 million, not including your primary residence. So it's problematic. What's more problematic here is that the company actually has to verify, and by verifying it's not just enough that you represent that you are an accredited investor to comply with Rule 506C. The company actually has to check that or have somebody check that, for example, looking at W-2s. Right? So none of these are easy. None of these options of raising tokens, selling, because it's security, it doesn't make it easy. If we are talking about actually using Reg A+, which doesn't come with this restriction on resale, that though comes with a restriction of actually a requirement of periodic reporting. So it's much easier. It's called like a mini IPO. It's not as onerous as a real full-blown registration statement that you have to file quarterly reporting, but here you have to file at least twice a year reports and financial statements. So you see why that is usually too expensive for a regular startup.
Interesting. Angela, do you want to talk about your research on blockchain and
Anytime,
cryptocurrencies?
yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So I've been researching in this area for a while. I'm also a law professor, like Mira, and my area of research is focused on the governance, primarily of blockchain systems, and thinking about the implications of the governance that is used in them. It's quite experimental. A lot of it comes from the type of governance that is used in kind of grassroots open source software, and thinking about the implications of using that in things that could become important parts of our financial system. I've also looked at the language in this space and the implications of what I consider to be quite problematic language. So what I mean by that is most descriptions that you see of blockchain technology, such as it's immutable, it's decentralized, it's secure, it's trustless, all of those, if you press on them with a critical analysis, they're overstatements for, I would say, pretty much every flavor of the technology. And in talking about the technology, I've encouraged kind of more precision in the way that people communicate about it, because if we adopt technology with the belief that it has characteristics that it doesn't, and we do it in important systems like we're considering, I think that has some very serious implications. So right now, my current research is a paper I'm working on called Deconstructing Decentralization. And this is a topic that's getting a lot of attention right now. What do we mean when we're talking about a decentralized system? It seems to be kind of this magic incantation that we say, oh, well, it's decentralized, right? It's decentralized. And all of a sudden, you get all these great characteristics out of it. You don't have intermediaries anymore. You don't have to trust people anymore. And it's unchangeable. Great, decentralization does that somehow. Well, what do we mean by that? I think it's actually kind of a code word for, being used in many ways as a code word for, don't worry about the power that's being used here behind this curtain, this kind of shield of decentralization. And if it's being used that way, I think it's very interesting, and we need to look behind that curtain and see where the power structures lie. And I think even in blockchains like Bitcoin, which people are quite comfortable calling decentralized and no intermediaries, I think we're overstating things again there quite a bit. I see lots of centralization in how decisions are being made about the code that's localized in a small group of core developers. I can talk, if we want to, later about the recent Bitcoin bug, a very significant bug that was remedied by just a few people, right? And then they were able to exert power and say, miners, upload this repair, right? That's particular people who have the passwords to enter things into the code. And the mining networks, there's been a lot of discussion about this over the past few years about how centralized they are. That it's just a few mining pools in most situations that that control the hashing power in systems like Bitcoin and Ethereum, and even more so in the smaller blockchains, which are actually really simple to 51% attack. So my research approaches all of this with a critical eye and thinks about accountability as well in the systems. So I'm not very popular for this one, but I've argued that core developers and big miners should be treated as fiduciaries in the systems because extreme amounts of trust are reposed in them, and everyone's counting on them not only to be competent, which certainly is the case, but also to be loyal and not take bribes from people to structure the code a particular way, et cetera. So again, it makes me very unpopular.
So what are the responsibilities of a fiduciary?
So a fiduciary is, lawyers are fiduciaries. Examples of them are lawyers, doctors, your certain financial advisors, right? And there's characteristics that they have. My analysis focuses kind of on a general idea of a fiduciary. What characteristics do all these types of fiduciaries have in common? And I won't go into the details here, but the trust that we repose in these parties and the vulnerability that people have to their actions, to the decisions that they make, the value of the currency itself, the value of the token itself depends on these people. They would certainly have to be more careful with what they do, right? Live up to a minimum standard of care. Perhaps things like the DAO wouldn't happen, where you just rush out code and there's bugs in it that end up having very significant effects on people.
So people can be sued if they...
Well, so that's the discussion, and that's why people say it's very unpractical, right? If you can be sued for it, well, no one's going to do it. Well, maybe we need to think about, do we need to grow up in this world and have some licensing and have people get insurance? And yeah, it's a big discussion, but I think we need to think about the important role that I would call them just new intermediaries are playing, and instead of seeing the world as we've gotten rid of the intermediaries, they've just shifted. So do they have equivalent responsibilities to those we've placed on them in the past?
And I imagine also like insider trading then becomes a more important issue. These people also trade in Bitcoin or
Absolutely,
cryptos.
yes. And there's no duties or expectations that they will disclose what their holdings are, how they might benefit from one decision or another. So they're dealing with things of value now, and their decisions, and I think the conflicts of interest one is a really interesting part of it. That would come in under a duty of loyalty. People say, oh, well, we can just handle this with products liability because it's just about competence and not coding, doing incorrect coding or something. But I think that it's not that simple. I think the conflicts play an important role.
Mira, do you have any opinion on fiduciary? Do you think the core developers are fiduciaries?
Well, to the extent that they're...
I want to create a conflict here.
That's the best place to be on the spot. So so to the extent there are agents, then they are. I like this idea about extended fiduciary duties here. To the extent that we can look at them as agents, we already have some fiduciary requirements from them. And to the extent that they are selling in ICOs without proper registration, then we actually can sue them. There are actually lawsuits, private lawsuits for damages and punitive damages that are already a threat, but it might be, the situation might call for more specific and more clarified fiduciary duties to the extent that they are actually viewed by the SEC as brokers, dealers. They're definitely fiduciaries, right? So they might already, the current laws might already impose on them extreme fiduciary duties, but there might be loopholes, and these need to be clarified.
So Daniel, do you see that these governance issues are important for regulators?
Yeah, so let me step back and say I think a lot of the challenges that Angela's highlighting are very valid areas of concern and places to be looking as this space evolves. But that being said, if you step back even further and ask yourself from a technological innovation perspective, what has happened? And I think on the and again, these are, to be clear, these are my own personal views, and I should have given my little spiel at the outset here. But from a CS perspective, and from just the fundamentals of human economic transactions, the breakthrough that Bitcoin represented, in its early days, is the idea that you can have so-called trustless transactions take place through the internet. And it's essentially utilizing the internet for what many people thought it would be able to do, which is, hey, you've got computers, you can connect computers, and people should be able to do things with as little friction as possible. So to the extent that you can use the internet to disintermediate and reduce friction in transactions, I think there are many who would argue that the computer science breakthrough moves us along that progression. Okay. And that's a big breakthrough. And I think there are many who look at it just from a pure CS perspective and say that's a fascinating solve to a challenge. We've always required a traditional intermediary, typically the bank, to sit in the middle of a payments transaction and be able to check a ledger and say, Daniel, you actually have this money has been moved into a different account. Now we're using a new type of a ledger system that in its purest form, and if it's fully functioning, creates obviously a ledger that everybody can see and is essentially updated real time, which should create efficiencies. So I think it's important to think a little bit about the innovation that has taken place. Now, are there challenges? Are there going to be new emerging risks that we can identify? Absolutely. And I think that's why these kinds of conversations are really important, and it's really important to be researching the depth and degree of decentralization. I mean, I agree that now we're starting to think, well, if you're going to make legal tests, and how decentralized does something need to be? Those are going to be new questions. And so look, from a lab CFTC perspective, I can say our job is to be as forward-looking as possible. We're here to look at where is the innovation taking place, how is it impacting markets, what are the potential opportunities and benefits that could derive, what are some of the risks and challenges that could derive. We started talking about ICOs, which is a slightly different animal. And again, I think nomenclature matters as well. And to make a distinction, if you've got a group that's trying to essentially raise money, in many senses that looks pretty traditional. You could use some of this technology either appropriately through securities exemptions if you do it the right way. There may be some that are doing this just to raise money and effectively engage in a traditional pump and dump scheme. And I mean, there's a lot of frauds that can take place that seem novel because you're using a new technology, but in fact, these are age-old schemes that are just cloaking themselves in innovation. So again, from our perspective, we will take kind of what we're learning and seeing. We have an Office of Customer Education and Outreach, which is essentially, think of it as an investor education office. We've been able to help support some of their efforts to put out some literature on some of the potential mythologies that are out there that are being perpetuated around, typically with ICOs. What's the value of a utility coin? Why would that continue to appreciate, to infinity? Those are things that we press people to actually ask themselves some questions before they engage in those types of investments. So, it's a broad topic, and I think that there's a lot that's happening across the spectrum, whether it's in the ICO world, your more kind of a traditional, original cryptocurrency world. And there will be some opportunities. I think our view is to try to focus on what good could come out of this. What do we see that's worth paying attention to? But also, what are some of the risks and challenges that we need to be mindful of as well?
So before I open it up to the audience questions, so most of the discussion has been focused on permissionless blockchains. So the typical cryptos. Now, another aspect of blockchain is the permissioned blockchains. So do you see legal challenges, Angela, also in these type of consortium blockchains?
So I have not focused my research as much on the permissioned blockchains. They don't seem, okay, so I'll just say what I think, I guess. I think they're completely different beasts, so it's weird to me that they go by the same name at all, right? I don't understand why they're called blockchain, and that's been a part of my research as well, is trying to force or encourage people to discuss things with their actual characteristics, right? So permission blockchains have completely different characteristics than public blockchains. I think their governance, there has been a lot less written about the governance of permission chains, and I think that has to do with the fact that we're already comfortable in some ways with how we run consortiums, and that there is a joint venture agreement or consortium agreement or something that is actually written down and that lawyers are very much involved in the drafting of, and everyone thinks very carefully at the beginning, ideally, about what the risks are and what the responsibilities are and how we're going to allocate those. So I think the governance there is more explicitly acknowledged and ideally hammered out. Now, I would very much like to see one of these consortium agreements. I have not been lucky enough to see one yet. But yeah, that's kind of where I am. And the technologists that I respect the most in the space seem to feel the same, that the innovation is much more on the permissionless side than the permissioned.
Daniel, you want to
Yeah, no, I think this is another, I mean, again, that's why terminology matters a lot. I mean, here's at least the way I've tried to think about this space, is that DLT, distributed ledger technology, I'm willing to just concede at this point, is a big tent, a big umbrella term that covers a lot of different technologies. And I think about a spectrum of activity that's taking place under that broad DLT umbrella. On the one end of the spectrum, in this private permissioned side of the world, and this is a gross oversimplification, but I'm going to just start it as the one end, the anchor here, is think about like a shared Google Doc, or if you were using like a shared Excel file. If everyone's able to enter in their transactions into one shared Excel file, yeah, there's a ledger that everybody's using real time. It would be more efficient than necessarily requiring an intermediary. And there's a lot, so again, the gross oversimplification, but there is a fair amount of activity happening in the, within markets, within consortia, where they're saying, hey, how can we essentially use interoperable databases with some potential additional features? And that's why I say it's a spectrum, because I think some of them do incorporate levels of validation and cryptography and automation, essentially, which might move it along the spectrum to have some attributes that are consistent with public blockchains. But they're not public blockchains, and I totally agree. It's a very different type of innovation. It may have some evolutionary, benefits to markets. Certainly can drive efficiencies, can reduce costs, can reduce manual processes. So I actually think it's an important area. I mean, databases matter, and if our computing infrastructure gets upgraded to be interoperable and to standardize data and formats, there could be a lot of value that comes out of it. From a regulatory perspective, we think about, would there be a future state where market participants are essentially doing their regulatory reporting through this type of an interoperable system, call it DLT or just an upgraded database, where the regulator is real-time able to see standardized data? That would be really powerful and a lot better than the current process of batching data and sending it on a one-off basis, frequently in different formats and standards. So that's that end of the spectrum. Then obviously once you open up that shared Excel file to the entire world, that's where the cryptocurrencies have come into play. It's the economic incentive to get these miners and validators to validate transactions and maintain the ledger. Big picture, what strikes me is that, Bitcoin made the conversation of ledgers a sexy topic. I mean, that's really what's happened. And that's why you've heard a lot of people say that, like, we've had this technology for 20 years. That's true. It's just nobody was really caring or thinking about how using, some type of a distributed ledger could actually generate efficiencies even in a permissioned context. So, from our perspective, we're interested in paying attention to the innovation across the spectrum. Some of it may be more evolutionary and incremental, but could be helpful from a computing infrastructure perspective. Some of it then gets you into the public blockchain world, where then again, from a regulatory perspective, we're focusing on things like cryptocurrencies.
I mean, to me, when I think about consortium, immediately I think about concerns about antitrust. Mira, do you have any opinion about, like, how do you regulate a consortium to prevent antitrust concerns?
Well, I'm not sure. I'm not really an expert in antitrust. I cannot really answer that when I don't see the real difference between that and a regular conglomerate. I mean, but going back to what you said before, the permission I can see wonderful opportunities for blockchains with permissions to solve many problems that we have right now in the law, for example, corporate ledgers. On the other hand, I'm worried about if you're going to talk about we have a blockchain with permission and a blockchain without permission. Oh, that's only permission, so that's okay. So I'm worried about do we draw the line, and people will just say, oh, if we just add permission, and it's just very easy to get permission, we might try to circumvent the law. So I don't think that regulatory authorities will let that happen, but I can anticipate that there will be people trying to go that route. And
Yeah, that's a great point. And so related to this, there's been a lot of efforts to try to define some of these terms in law. Okay, so a number of states have been doing this, trying to define blockchain, and it's for reasons like enabling smart contracts to be used in law and various things. And I believe there's actually now legislation at the federal level to create a commission that will define blockchain, which I think is very silly. But you're right, like once you define something, you create the opportunity for gamesmanship around it if there are consequences to being in that definition, in that concept or out.
All right. Let's open it up to the audience. Anyone has any questions? Ali.
Very interesting discussion. As a follow-up, it's more of a speculation that's what I'm interested in. We all know that there's a large group of lobbyists that are pushing different states and interests in Washington. The nexus of politics, economics, and law. If there is going to be a nasty surprise when it comes someday, we want that nasty surprise to be what that would be.
Yeah, Angela, go ahead.
Okay, so this is something that I like to worry about, worst case scenarios, right? And thank you for that softball question. So I worry about us making decisions based on misunderstandings, ignoring governance issues around the actual crypto assets that make them essentially a high-risk asset that we're acting as if we understand. And then we act like we understand it, and we put it into other financial products, such as Bitcoin futures, such as ETFs, such as hedge funds, such as collateral for loans, such as everything else that finance does, right? And then there are, once it's widely integrated into the financial system, and we've got, as we're talking about, all the institutional money there, and all the pension funds and university endowments have all invested in it, right? Then there's some sort of crazy governance crisis that the whole system goes down, and we've managed to integrate it to where it doesn't just pull down the products that are directly tied, right, to the crypto asset itself, but we've intertwined it with our financial system in such a way that it pulls a lot more of it down, everything. So I see a lot of analogies here to the subprime mortgages that were talked about a little bit earlier, that it's a poorly understood risky asset that once integrated broadly enables those risks to permeate. So I'm concerned about the speed of integration into financial products, and I'm concerned about you mentioned lobbying. There is a very powerful lobbying force for crypto assets, cryptocurrencies, blockchain generally. So I think we need to be really vigilant and make sure that we're getting a balanced take. That everyone on the spectrum is included in these discussions as we're making decisions. People who are proponents, people who are very concerned, people who are somewhere in the middle. Every voice needs to be heard because I think these are really potentially consequential decisions.
Daniel, what keeps you up at night?
Well, so you know, just one follow-on point. I mean, look, obviously being mindful of the potential for systemic risks is critical, and it's kind of incumbent on regulators, and that's something that FSOC, through taking a look at whether there are systemic risks that could derive from various areas of finance is kind of part and parcel of what regulators do. I mean, the one thing I would comment at this stage, and I think that you need to be thinking about where does this go, how is it being incorporated by institutions, but if you look at what's the total market cap right now of crypto, 200 billion around that amount,
it's small now.
which is still, that's less than the market cap of many large, single U.S. companies. So not to say that you don't have to be mindful of where does it go. I mean, that could be today 200 billion, and of course in 2 years that could be 200 billion. So it's something you have to pay attention to. But that being said, I think back to broadly speaking, it's not even in the crypto space. I think Angela actually hit this. It's like technological literacy. To me, that's probably the greatest that I've seen emerging risk across the board. And again, I'm outside of the crypto space. It's whether you're talking about machine learning, new areas that we're using machines and computers to power different types of business models and operations. Everything is fundamentally being driven by tech today. And I do worry that there's just kind of a fundamental lack of technological literacy, amongst whether it's leadership at companies. You might be a CEO sitting at your company and your business has transformed dramatically over the last few decades, where you went from kind of manual trading operations to something that an open pits to now everything is tech. And if you have to essentially rely on having a really good chief technology officer to know that your systems are up to snuff and that you have the right types of protections in place, whether we're talking about cybersecurity, which has become obviously a topic that we're hearing about every day. So I do think tech literacy, broadly speaking, is a really important subject. And since we're here at a university, I'll make my plug. All of you are, to the extent you're students, you're probably taking some tech-based classes, CS classes, but I highly recommend that to anybody just so you can even understand the language and know what questions to be asking. I think that's really important. I think it's only going to become increasingly important going forward.
Thank you. Any more questions? All right, thank you so much.
Thank you.